Hello, everyone. In today's story, please listen to how a family conflict changed the lives of everyone involved. Now let's begin. I was fired for a decision I didn't have the authority to make. 2 days earlier, that decision had been documented in writing. But when the county software launch failed, my manager said I'd made it alone, and everyone in the room treated his explanation like it was the official record. That's the sentence I still have trouble saying without hearing the conference room go quiet. I worked at Harbor Point Civic Systems in Columbus, Ohio, as an implementation coordinator. We built permitting and inspection software for county governments. which sounds dry until you remember that real people use those systems to schedule inspections, track permits, and move construction projects forward. Our major project was Civic Flow 4.2, a migration for Franklin County's online building permit portal. I coordinated the work, I tracked deadlines, brought the right people into meetings, and made sure open issues didn't disappear between departments. But I did not approve the final production cutover. That authority belonged to Grant Keller, my manager and the director of client delivery. Grant was polished, calm, the kind of person who could praise you in front of a room and make it sound like he was doing you a favor. He talked constantly about ownership, speed, and protecting the launch date. The problem was that our final data validation wasn't complete. In plain English, the old system and the new system were supposed to compare permit status records before public release. That comparison found a defect. I recommended keeping the production hold in place until the records could be reconciled. Grant disagreed. He wanted the county launch date protected. I understood the pressure. Everyone did. But understanding pressure isn't the same as believing it makes a risk disappear. And this is where I need to be honest about my part. I warned him verbally. I raised the concern in the project chat. I asked what would happen if records didn't match after the migration. But I didn't immediately export those messages. I didn't ask for a separate approval matrix. I trusted that because Grant had final authority, his written direction would protect the people following it. That was my mistake, not causing the failure, not secretly approving a cutover. My mistake was assuming the truth would remain obvious after the meeting ended. The launch testing began, and the records failed to reconcile the way I'd warned they might. Public access had to be postponed for 48 hours while the team paused, repaired, and verified the system. Then came the emergency meeting. Grant described the bypass as my independent decision. He implied I had ignored established procedure. He used calm, careful language, the kind that sounds responsible even when it changes what actually happened. 2 business days later, I was dismissed for failing to follow release protocol. My family depended on my income, so this wasn't just an insult to my pride. It changed the pressure at home immediately. I had to explain that I'd lost my job while still being unable to prove in that moment why. Weeks later, I would hold an archived email that contradicted Grant's version in one ordinary sentence. The question that stayed with me was simple. Why had a confident explanation mattered more than a dated record? I didn't know the answer yet. I only knew I needed to find the record before someone else's version became permanent. When I joined the final 6-week coordination phase for Civic Flow 4.2, I thought the hardest part would be keeping everyone aligned. That was my job at Harbor Point Civic Systems. I coordinated schedules, tracked open questions, made sure the county knew what was happening, and tried to translate technical problems into plain language before they became emergencies. Harbor Point operated out of a renovated warehouse in Columbus's Franklinton district. The office had exposed brick, polished concrete floors, glass conference rooms, and open workstations where everyone could hear everyone else's meetings. It looked collaborative. Most days, it even felt that way. We built permitting and inspection platforms for county governments, which meant our work had a very specific kind of pressure. If a restaurant owner couldn't see an inspection result or a contractor couldn't check a permit status, that wasn't just an annoying software glitch. Someone's project could sit still. A county employee could spend hours answering calls. A resident could wonder whether their application had disappeared. Civic Flow 4.2 was supposed to make that process faster and more reliable for Franklin County. The migration would move years of permit information from the old system into the updated platform. The public portal would look cleaner, load faster, and connect more directly with the county's inspection records. On the project plan, it looked like a straight line toward launch. In reality, it looked more like a stack of plates balanced on a moving truck. Grant Keller was my manager and the director of client delivery. He was polished, calm, and very good at making difficult decisions sound simple. In meetings, he praised people by name. If a client complimented the team, Grant repeated it in front of leadership. If a deadline looked impossible, he smiled and said, "We'll find a way." I respected him. At the time, I also confused confidence with certainty. Tessa Nguyen led quality assurance. She and I had once been peers, and we still worked well together, but she had a careful way of approaching anything that could affect production data. Tessa carried a small paper planner through an office full of laptops and digital dashboards. She wrote down dates, decisions, and the names of people who attended meetings. I used to tease her about it. She'd just tap the planner and say, "Paper doesn't lose access when a password changes." I thought she was being cautious. I didn't realize how important that caution was. On February 17th, testing found a problem with permit status records. The old system and the new system didn't agree on every status. A permit marked under review in one place could appear as submitted in another. That didn't mean every record was wrong. It meant we couldn't safely assume the records that looked right had actually reconciled. The validation hold existed for that exact reason. Before public release, the system compared the old and new records. The team reviewed exceptions, corrected the mismatches, and documented what had been cleared. It was slower than simply pushing the migration through, but it protected the county from opening a portal filled with confusing or incomplete information. I recommended keeping the hold in place. I said it in the project meeting, then again in a follow-up message. I explained that we had a reconciliation risk and needed more time to verify the exceptions. Grant didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Mara, we're not going to turn a manageable issue into a launch crisis." I replied, "I'm not calling it a crisis. I'm saying we don't know whether the records are complete yet." He looked toward the others in the room. "Then manage the uncertainty," he said. That sentence stayed with me because it sounded reasonable. Almost every bad instruction I received from Grant arrived wrapped in reasonable language. The county launch date was important to Harbor Point. It was also important to Grant personally because his promotion review was approaching, and successful launches were part of how leadership measured him. I knew that. Everyone on the delivery team knew that. What I didn't understand was how much pressure that created, or how quickly schedule protection could become more important than a clean approval record. The next morning, Grant sent an email to the launch group. He directed us to move the validation hold until after launch and record the change as an approved schedule exception. I read it twice. Then I walked to his office. "Are you sure you want the validation completed after public release?" I asked. Grant didn't look surprised. He pointed to the chair across from him. "We're not ignoring the issue," he said. "We're sequencing the work. The county portal would open before we finish confirming the records." "Correct. And if the exceptions don't reconcile, then we reconcile them." I remember sitting there with my notebook open, my pen resting across the page. "Could you put the approval language in the release reco RD?" I asked, "just so the decision is clear." Grant gave me a tired smile. "You have the email. That should have been enough for me to stop and document everything separately." It wasn't. I told myself that Grant had final operational authority. He was my manager. He was the director responsible for the launch. If he made a schedule decision in writing, I believed that decision would protect me. That belief was my mistake. I didn't export the project chat. I didn't save a copy of every message to a personal work file. I didn't request a signed approval matrix showing exactly who could override the validation hold. I kept my color-coded notebook. I kept my calendar. I kept the email in my company account, but I treated access as if it were the same thing as ownership. The project chat moved quickly that week. Engineers posted test results, the county asked for updated timing, and Grant reminded everyone that the launch date had already been communicated externally. When I raised the reconciliation concern again, he told me to record the decision and keep moving. "If we need to clean up after launch, we'll clean up after launch," he said. I wrote the schedule exception into the project notes. I should have written who instructed it, why I disagreed, and what risk remained. Instead, I wrote what I thought my manager expected to see. That's the part I've had to be honest about. Grant made the decision, but I helped create the silence around it. I accepted an informal chain of command because challenging it felt like slowing down the entire team. And at Harbor Point, slowing things down was treated almost like a character flaw. By the end of the week, the launch checklist showed green boxes beside the items that still made me nervous. The validation hold had been moved. The schedule was intact. Grant told the team we were ready. 2 days later, the launch began, and the system gave us the answer we'd been trying not to hear. By February 20th, the checklist showed green. That was the phrase everyone wanted to hear. Green meant the migration was ready, the county's launch date was protected, and nobody had to explain why we'd held the project back. But green on a checklist didn't mean every record had reconciled. It only meant the validation hold had been moved. We were in the office early that morning, gathered around the glass conference room with coffee going cold beside our laptops. The Civic Flow 4.2 migration was moving through launch testing before public access opened. Engineers were watching the transfer in real time, and I was checking the status reports against the old permit system. At first, the mismatch looked small. Then another one appeared. A permit that had been marked approved in the old system showed as pending in the new one. A status that should have carried over as closed appeared without the corresponding update. The records weren't disappearing, but they weren't agreeing either. That was the reconciliation risk I'd warned about. I leaned toward my screen and said, "Stop the public release. We need to compare the source and destination records before this goes any further." Nobody answered right away. Then Grant said, "How many? Right now? Enough that I don't trust the sample." He stood behind one of the chairs, looking at the dashboard. He didn't raise his voice. That was part of what made him effective. Grant could make a serious problem sound like an inconvenient detail in an otherwise successful morning. "Can engineering isolate the affected statuses?" he asked. "They're checking." "Then let's not turn a contained issue into a launch failure." I looked at him. "The launch is already paused." He gave me a calm, almost patient expression. "The launch is being managed." That distinction didn't matter to the county. Public access was postponed for 48 hours while the engineering and quality teams repaired the transfer and verified the records. 48 hours may not sound dramatic unless you're responsible for a government service people expect to use and unless the entire company has spent weeks insisting the date cannot move. The conference room emptied and refilled throughout the day. People compared files, reviewed logs, and tested corrections. Tessa kept her paper planner open beside her keyboard. I noticed her writing down the time of each decision. I wish I'd done the same in that moment. Instead, I kept trying to solve the problem. By late afternoon, Grant called an emergency meeting. The room was crowded, and people stood along the back wall. The county account team joined by video. I brought my notebook because I still believed that if I explained the sequence clearly, the facts would take care of themselves. Grant began with a summary. During launch testing, the final validation step was bypassed without the required approval, he said. That allowed incomplete permit status records to move forward. I felt my stomach tighten. He continued, "Mara made the decision to proceed based on her assessment that the remaining risk was manageable." I said, "That isn't what happened." Grant turned toward me. "We'll get to your perspective." "My perspective is that you directed us to move the hold." The room went quiet. Grant folded his hands on the table. "I instructed the team to manage the validation issue within the launch plan. I did not authorize anyone to disregard release protocol. You told me to record it as a schedule exception. I told you to coordinate the exception process. That's not the same thing." "No," he said, "it isn't." His tone stayed measured, which somehow made my objection sound emotional before I'd even finished making it. I tried to explain the February 17 testing results, my recommendation to keep the hold, and the conversation that followed. I mentioned the project chat where I'd repeated the concern, but when I opened my laptop, I couldn't access the chat anymore. My account had not yet been formally deactivated, but the project workspace was already unavailable to me. I refreshed the page twice, then a third time. Nothing. The meeting recording didn't help. It began after the part where the launch exception had been discussed, capturing only the emergency meeting itself. My voice was there, but the earlier instruction wasn't. Grant looked at the group and said, "This is exactly why release protocol exists. Individual judgment cannot replace an approved control." I stared at him. He had used the control I'd asked to protect as evidence that I had ignored it. Nobody shouted, nobody slammed a laptop shut. That would have been easier to understand. Instead, people nodded, typed notes, and asked practical questions about the recovery plan. The facts were being rearranged in real time, and the room was accepting the new shape because Grant spoke with confidence. Afterward, 2 coworkers who had always stopped by my desk began sending only formal emails. One addressed me as Mara Ellis. Another copied Grant on every question, even questions she'd previously asked me directly. I understood what was happening. People were protecting themselves. I couldn't even blame them completely. The company had made it clear that the safest version of events was the version coming from the director. Over the weekend, I kept opening my notebook and reading the same pages. I had dates. I had the testing results. I had written down that Grant wanted the hold moved and the exception recorded, but I hadn't written, "Grant instructed me to do this." I trusted the hierarchy to speak for itself. On Monday, February 24th, I was asked to join a meeting with Grant and a people team representative. The representative had a folder in front of her. Grant had no folder that I could see. That detail bothered me later. At the time, I was focused on the email they'd sent me. The reason for dismissal was failure to follow release protocol. I read it twice, then I looked up. "You're saying I was dismissed for bypassing a control I told Grant we needed to keep?" Grant leaned back. "This is a clarification of responsibility." I let out a small, humorless laugh. I couldn't stop it. "A clarification?" "Mara," he said, "the project required someone to make a judgment call. You made it." "No, you made it, and I followed your written schedule exception." "Where is that written?" The question landed hard because I didn't have it with me. I knew there had been an email. I remembered the project chat. I remembered the call, but my account access had been removed and the recording was incomplete. Grant's question made my memory sound like an excuse. The people representative explained the decision in careful language. I was told when benefits would end, how to return company property, and that my system access would be deactivated immediately. I gathered my notebook and stood. Grant said, "I hope you understand this isn't personal." I looked at the termination letter in my hand. "It's my job." He didn't answer. When I got home, I sat in my car for several minutes before going inside. My family knew the launch had gone badly. They didn't know I was about to tell them I'd lost my job. I tried to make the explanation orderly. I said the project had failed during testing, that public access had been postponed for 48 hours, and that Grant was saying I'd made the decision alone. My voice cracked on the last sentence. My family didn't ask why I hadn't protected myself better. They asked whether I was okay, whether I could cover the next month, and what I needed that evening. That kindness made me feel worse before it made me feel better. I wanted to send a company-wide message. I wanted to attach every detail I remembered and force everyone to read it. But I also knew that anger would not restore my access, prove the instruction existed, or protect my family's income, so I didn't send it. Instead, I filed for unemployment and contacted an Ohio employment attorney named Priya Shah. She listened while I explained the timeline, then asked questions Grant hadn't asked. "What records exist outside your account?" she said. I opened my notebook. For the first time, I stopped trying to tell the story as a defense and started rebuilding it as evidence. The next morning, I read Harbor Point's termination paperwork again, slower this time. Near the bottom, it referenced the company's records retention policy. Business email, it said, was automatically archived for 7 years. I sat very still. I didn't know yet whether that archive held anything useful, but I knew where my first lawful search had to begin. By the time I met with Priya Shah, I'd stopped trying to remember the whole story in order. Memory doesn't arrive like a spreadsheet. It comes in flashes. Grant's hand resting on the conference table. The county project name on the screen. The sudden silence after he said, I'd made the decision alone. Then I'd remember something smaller, like the blue mug I'd been holding, and wonder whether I was focusing on details because the important part was slipping away. Priya told me to stop treating that as a personal failure. Start with what you know, she said. Dates, documents, who had authority, what changed. Don't fill gaps with guesses. So I opened the termination packet on my kitchen table and made 4 columns in one of my color-coded notebooks. What happened, what I personally observed, what I could verify, what I needed to preserve. The first column was easy. Civic Flow 4.2 failed during launch testing on February 20th. Permit status records didn't reconcile correctly. Public access was postponed for 48 hours. Grant blamed me in the emergency meeting. 2 business days later, Harbor Point dismissed me for allegedly failing to follow release protocol. The second column was harder because it forced me to write down what I didn't have. I had warned Grant verbally. I had warned him in the project chat. I had heard him tell me to treat the bypass as a schedule exception. But I didn't have the chat anymore. I didn't have a complete recording of the emergency meeting. And I didn't have a signed approval matrix showing that Grant held final operational authority over the cutover. I had assumed those things would be obvious to everyone who worked there. That assumption had cost me. Priya asked me to pull up every personal record connected to the project. I had my calendar, my notebook, a few meeting invitations, and some emails that had been copied to my private address because they involved scheduling. I also reviewed Harbor Point's policies, which were still publicly available on the company website. I wasn't trying to dig into anything private. I was looking for the rules Harbor Point said it followed. The release policy described a final validation hold before production access. It said, exceptions had to be documented and approved by the operational owner. That phrase made me stop. Operational owner. I went back to the project documents I had saved and found the responsibility chart. Grant was listed as the operational owner. I was listed as implementation coordinator. It wasn't a dramatic discovery, no music played. No one called me to say I'd been right. But I stared at those 2 titles for a long time. I'd been coordinating meetings, tracking dependencies, and keeping the county informed. I had not been the person authorized to approve the final cutover. Priya read the documents over a video call and made me say that out loud. You coordinated the migration, she said. You did not have authority to approve the final production cutover. I know. No, you know it in your head. I need you to put it in the timeline. So I wrote it down. I did not have authority to approve the final production cutover. That sentence became the line I returned to whenever I started doubting myself. Priya also told me to make a narrow preservation request through Harbor Point's formal appeal process. Not a broad demand for every message anyone had ever sent. Not a request for private employee information. Just the records connected to the launch decision and my termination. She was very clear about that. Your goal is a defensible record, she said. The more precise you are, the harder it is for anyone to describe your request as emotional or excessive. That stung a little because I was emotional. I was furious. I was scared about money. I was trying to explain to my family why my direct deposit had stopped when 2 weeks earlier I'd been planning the county launch. But I understood what she meant. I submitted the appeal with dates, project names, and the specific records I was asking Harbor Point to preserve. The February 17th validation discussion. The February 18th launch instruction. The February 20th emergency meeting. The February 24th termination decision. 2 days later, Luis Romero sent a short acknowledgement. Your request has been received. We will review the materials under the applicable company process. That was it. I read it 3 times. There was no statement that Harbor Point was concerned. No acknowledgement that the situation might have been mishandled. No promise that anyone would contact me soon. It felt less like support and more like a receipt from a store. Priya told me not to read emotion into it. He's creating a record, she said, or protecting the company. Those can be the same thing at this stage. That answer stayed with me. A week later, Tessa asked if she could speak with me. We met at a coffee shop near the office, not because either of us wanted to be secretive, but because she didn't want to have the conversation inside Harbor Point. She carried her small paper planner in one hand and kept both hands around her coffee when we sat down. For a few minutes, we talked about nothing important. Then she said, "I remember the call. I didn't move." "What part?" "The validation hold." Her eyes dropped to the planner. "I wasn't on the whole thing. I joined near the end. Grant was talking about the county date, and you were explaining why the records needed one more reconciliation pass." "That sounds right." He said we could move the hold to post-launch reconciliation. I felt my shoulders tighten. Tessa looked at me carefully. "I'm not saying I remember every word. I wrote down the phrase because it sounded unusual." She turned the planner toward me. The page was dated February 19th. Under the project name, she had written a time, a short list of attendees, and one sentence. "Discussed moving validation hold to post-launch reconciliation. Grant wants schedule exception recorded." My throat went dry. "You wrote this before the launch?" "Yes." "Why?" She gave a small, uncomfortable shrug. "I write things down when I'm not sure the decision is going to age well." That was the most Tessa answer I could imagine. I asked whether she had the email. "No, I don't have access to the launch group anymore, and I never saved it." She paused. "But I remember Grant telling you to document the exception." I looked at the page again. It wasn't the missing instruction. It didn't prove every part of my account, but it placed the conversation in time, and it confirmed something I had been afraid to say out loud. I hadn't invented Grant's direction after the failure. Tessa told me she was nervous about getting involved. "I'm up for review," she said, "and I don't want it to look like I'm taking sides." "I'm not asking you to take my side." "I know, that's why I'm talking to you." I thanked her, then asked if she would submit the planner note through the formal process herself. She agreed. I didn't take a picture. I didn't ask her to send me anything that belonged to Harbor Point. She kept her own notes, and I documented that she had offered to provide them. That distinction mattered to me. I didn't want to win by creating another messy record. After Tessa submitted her statement, I sent Luis a focused request for the archived email thread from February 18th. Harbor Point's paperwork had said, business email was automatically archived for 7 years, even when an employee's account was deactivated. I had read that sentence so many times it had started to look meaningless. Now it felt like a locked door with a key hanging beside it. The reply came on a Monday morning. Luis asked me to confirm the date range, the subject line if I knew it, and the names of the likely participants. I gave him everything I had: Grant, me, the launch group. February 18th. Then I waited. I tried to work on unemployment paperwork. I called the benefits office. I made a grocery list. I answered my mother's text about whether I'd eaten lunch, but my attention kept returning to my email. At 4:17 that afternoon, a message arrived from Luis. The subject line said, "Archived project correspondence." I opened the attachment. There were several messages in the thread: scheduling details, a note about the county's launch window, a reply from one of the technical leads asking whether the validation report would be complete before cutover. And then I saw Grant's name. The message was dated February 18th and addressed to me and 2 other people on the launch group. I read the first paragraph twice before I reached the sentence that changed everything. Move the validation hold to post-launch reconciliation. I stopped breathing for a second. Then I read the rest. Grant said the county launch date needed to be preserved. He called the change an approved schedule exception and instructed us to document the reconciliation work for the post-launch period. It was ordinary workplace language. CALM, polished, the kind of sentence that could disappear in a crowded inbox. I whispered it aloud anyway. Move the validation hold to post-launch reconciliation. Grant had written it, not suggested it privately, not hinted at it in a hallway. He had sent it to the launch group. I printed the message and carried the pages to the kitchen. My hands were shaking so badly that I had to set them flat on the table. I expected to feel victorious. I didn't. I felt sad that a sentence this ordinary had to rescue my entire reputation. Then I noticed the names in the recipient line. Grant had not sent the instruction only to me. 2 other launch participants had received it too. That meant the question was no longer just whether I could prove Grant had directed the bypass. The question was why I had been dismissed as if no one else had seen the decision. And before I could answer that, I had to find out whether those 2 people were willing to confirm what the email already showed. Priya Shah helped me turn a pile of painful memories into something a stranger could actually review. She didn't call it a story, she called it an evidence packet. That distinction mattered. My first draft had too much explanation. I wrote about how Grant spoke in meetings, how people went quiet around him, how I felt when my coworkers stopped answering my texts. Priya read it carefully, then tapped the pages with one finger. "Those details may matter," she said, "but we need to separate what you know from what you inferred." I nodded, even though that was harder than I expected, so we rebuilt it from the calendar backward. February 18th, Grant's email instructing me to move the validation hold to post-launch reconciliation. February 19th, my notebook entry, Tessa's planner note, and the project schedule showing the exception. February 20th, the failed launch test, the 48-hour postponement, and the emergency meeting. February 24th, my termination paperwork, which said I'd failed to follow release protocol. I added the Harbor Point policy that required the operational owner to approve any exception. I added the record showing that I was the implementation coordinator, not the person with final authority over the production cutover. Then I added Tessa's note. She had written the date in her small paper planner. She remembered Grant telling us to document the exception so the launch date wouldn't move. She didn't claim to remember every word. She didn't pretend she had seen the archived email. That honesty made her note stronger. At the end of the packet, Priya had me write a short statement explaining what I wanted. Not revenge, not a public apology. I wanted the company why to correct the reason for my dismissal, preserve the relevant records, and review whether the decision had been represented accurately. When I read that sentence back, it sounded almost too modest for what had happened. My job, my benefits, and my professional reputation had been taken away based on a version of events I believed was false. But Priya shook her head. "Specific requests are harder to dismiss," she said. "You're giving them a path to do the right thing." I sent the packet through Harbor Point's formal appeal channel on March 5th. I copied Priya and asked for written confirmation that records from earlier projects led by Grant Keller would be preserved. I kept the request narrow. I didn't ask for private personnel files or client data. I didn't ask anyone to send me confidential documents. I asked Harbor Point to retain records that could show whether the same approval process had been used before. Then I messaged 3 former co-workers. I kept the message almost painfully simple. I told them I was appealing my dismissal and that Harbor Point was reviewing the release decision. If they had first-hand information, they could use the formal process. I would not pressure them to take sides, forward private files, or tell me anything they weren't comfortable sharing. One person replied with a thumbs up and nothing else. A no there said she didn't want to be involved. I understood both responses. When someone has watched a workplace turn on one person, Even a polite question can feel like a trap. I didn't want anyone to think helping me meant joining a campaign against Grant. I wasn't building one. I was trying to stop the record from being rewritten. Luis Romero acknowledged the preservation request the next morning. His email was brief. Harbor Point will preserve the materials identified in your submission while the matter is reviewed. We will assess the allegations against available records and witness accounts. That was not warmth. It was not an admission. It was exactly what I needed. For a few hours, I felt the smallest sense of steadiness. Then Grant contacted me through the HR channel. The subject line said, "Clarification of February 20th discussion." I stared at it before opening it. My hand was resting on the mouse, but I couldn't make myself click. Part of me wanted to leave it unread. Another part knew that silence wouldn't make it disappear. The message said he was concerned that my appeal relied on an incomplete recollection of the launch meeting. He wrote that the team had understood validation could not be bypassed without approval, and that I had taken ownership of the timing decision in real time. Then came the sentence that made my stomach tighten. Grant said he regretted that I now viewed the outcome differently, but he believed the termination had been an appropriate clarification of responsibility. I read it twice. A small, humorless laugh came out of me. Clarification of responsibility. That was the same phrase he'd used in the termination meeting, polished and empty enough to sound neutral. He wasn't calling me dishonest outright. He was doing something more careful. He was suggesting that my memory had become unreliable because I was upset. I forwarded the message to Priya without responding. She called me within an hour. "Don't debate him," she said. "Don't correct every sentence. We'll acknowledge receipt through the process. I want to tell him he was in charge." "I know." "He knows he was in charge." "I know." I looked around my apartment. My unpaid electric bill was on the counter. My mother had offered to help with groceries, and I had said I was fine even though I was counting every purchase. My younger brother had stopped asking how the appeal was going because I kept giving him the same answer. Nothing was fine, but Priya was right. If I answered Grant emotionally, he could point to my tone instead of his instructions. So I wrote one sentence. Received. I will continue to communicate about this matter through the formal review process. I sent it, then put my phone face down. That boundary felt strangely powerful, not dramatic, not satisfying in the way a perfect comeback might have been satisfying, just clean. A few days later, Tessa asked if we could meet by video. She was sitting at her kitchen table with her paper planner beside her. I recognized the blue cover. She'd carried it through nearly every meeting at Harbor Point, even though no one else took handwritten notes anymore. "I want to explain something," she said. I waited. Tessa told me that 18 months earlier, she had been involved in a different county rollout. There had been a data quality concern close to launch. She had recommended delaying the release until the issue was reconciled. Grant said we could handle it after launch, she told me. He told me to treat it as a schedule exception. Was that documented? She paused. Not the way it should have been. I didn't interrupt. She said the launch went forward, the team encountered a problem, and Grant later described the decision as something she had chosen without authorization. Her performance review changed after that. The language shifted from strong and dependable to struggles with ownership under pressure. I felt my chest go cold. That's almost exactly what he said about me. I know. Did you tell anyone? I tried. She looked down at the planner. I was told the review was about my judgment, not his instructions. Tessa didn't claim her experience proved mine. She didn't say every detail matched. She was careful about that, but she did remember Grant using a phrase that had stayed with her. Post-launch reconciliation, she said. I remember because it sounded like a solution, but it put all the risk after the public release. I wrote the phrase down even though I already knew it. Then Tessa told me she had preserved her own quality control notes and would submit them directly to compliance if Luis requested them. She would not send them to me. She would not share client information. She would not make public accusations. I respected that. Thank you, I said. I'm scared, she admitted. So am I. That was the most honest part of the conversation. Neither of us knew what Harbor Point would do with the information. The company could decide that my email was enough to fix the termination record and leave everything else untouched. It could call Tessa's experience unrelated. It could protect Grant because he was still a director with influential allies and a promotion review ahead of him. Or it could look at the structure instead of the personalities. A few days later, Luis asked to speak with me. He joined the video call with his legal pad in front of him. He asked for dates before opinions. He wanted to know which records I had personally seen, which facts came from Tessa, and which conclusions I was drawing from the pattern. At one point, he stopped me. One contradiction can be an error, he said. A repeated structure is a control problem. I didn't say anything. He explained that Harbor Point was pausing the ordinary appeal timeline while compliance reviewed the broader concerns. He said the company had identified enough questions to appoint an outside workplace investigator. An outside investigator. The words landed slowly. Luis said the investigator would speak with me, Tessa, Grant, and other witnesses. They would review the civic flow records, the archived email, approval logs, the termination file, and records from 3 earlier projects. I asked whether Grant would remain in his role during the review. Effective today, Luis said, he will not directly supervise delivery staff. It wasn't a public confession. It wasn't punishment. It was a temporary safeguard. I appreciated the difference. Before we ended the call, Luis said, I need you to understand that the investigation will examine your decisions too. I do? You may be asked why you didn't export the chat, request a signed approval matrix, or stop the launch more forcefully. My throat tightened. I understand. Because those questions were fair. I had warned Grant. I had recognized the risk. I had failed to protect the record. I had assumed authority would work like a shield instead of realizing it could become a story someone else held over me. That was my part, but being imperfect at documentation didn't give anyone permission to misrepresent my authority. After the call, I wrote that sentence in my notebook. Then I wrote another one beneath it. I can accept responsibility for what I failed to document without accepting responsibility for a decision I did not own. The next morning, Luis sent a formal notice confirming the investigator's appointment. Attached was a list of requested materials: Civic Flow 4.2, the prior healthcare permitting rollout, a county inspection migration from the year before, and one more project I remembered only because Grant had once called the employee involved someone who couldn't handle ownership. I read the list twice. The case was no longer just about whether one email had been misunderstood. Someone was about to compare the records. The investigator's first interview lasted just over 2 hours. It happened in a glass conference room at Harbor Point, with the blinds half closed and a legal pad centered in front of me. Luis was there for the opening, but he left after confirming that I could answer without going through Grant or anyone in client delivery. The investigator began with a question I'd heard several times by then. What did you personally observe on February 18th through the 24th? Not what I believed, not what Grant intended, not what the company should have known. What did I personally observe? So I started with the email. I explained the validation hold, the data mismatch, the launch pressure, and Grant's instruction to move the hold to post-launch reconciliation. I described the project chat as accurately as I could, while admitting that I no longer had access to it. I told her I'd warned Grant verbally and in writing before the cutover, but I hadn't exported the messages or asked for a separate approval record. That part still embarrassed me. I'd been coordinating the migration. I knew documentation mattered. I'd reminded other people to update their notes, close their open questions, and attach approvals to the right project record. But when the pressure came from my own manager, I treated his authority like protection. It wasn't. The investigator asked whether I had ever believed I possessed final cutover authority. No, I said. I coordinated the work. I did not approve production release. She wrote that down. Then she asked, "Why do you think Mr. Keller described the decision differently?" I took a breath. I can't state his reason as fact. I can say the explanation he gave placed responsibility on me, even though the archived email showed he directed the exception. I can say the timing protected his version of the launch decision. That was the kind of answer Priya had trained me to give. Careful, specific, and limited to what the records could support. It felt less satisfying than saying what I really thought. It also felt stronger. Tessa's interview happened later that week. She brought her paper planner in a clear folder, even though the investigator had already received scans of the relevant pages. Tessa didn't dramatize anything. That was never her style. She pointed to an entry from 18 months earlier. The project name had been abbreviated, followed by a question mark, and the words, "Validation hold, move after launch." Below it, she had written the same phrase Grant used with me. Post-launch reconciliation. The investigator looked up. Who was present when this was discussed? Tessa gave the names of the people she remembered and identified Grant as the person who told the group to treat the exception as approved. Was there a formal approval log, the investigator asked. Not one that I was shown, Tessa said. And what happened after the rollout? Tessa paused. The rollout had issues. Grant said the analyst had made a judgment call, then the analyst's performance review changed. She didn't say that Grant had ruined the person's career. She didn't make a speech about unfairness. She simply described the sequence and handed over her notes. That restraint made the pattern harder to dismiss. A few days later, the investigator contacted Dana Brooks. Dana had been a manager at Harbor Point before leaving for a regional healthcare software firm. She was the former employee Tessa had mentioned, the one whose project had also ended with a disputed authorization. Dana initially declined to participate. She told the investigator she didn't want to reopen her departure, and I understood that completely. There's a point after leaving a bad situation when even a fair question can feel like an invitation to step back inside it. The investigator explained that Harbor Point was reviewing its authorization process, not asking Dana to make public accusations or disclose confidential client information. Dana still waited before responding. Then, after a few days, she submitted documents through the formal process. She'd not email me the files. She didn't post them online. She sent old calendar invitations, meeting summaries, and a copy of the project's internal approval page directly to the investigator. One calendar invitation was labeled Approval Reset. The official project summary described the meeting as a routine schedule review. Those were not the same thing. In Dana's meeting summary, Grant was listed as present. The note said the team would proceed with a temporary exception and complete reconciliation after launch. The language wasn't identical to my email, but it was close enough to make my hands go cold. The same decision structure, the same missing approval record. the same later explanation that the employee had acted independently. I read the materials only after the investigator confirmed they were part of the review. Even then, I had to remind myself that a matching phrase wasn't proof of every detail. But the phrase wasn't standing alone anymore. It sat beside Tessa's planner, the archived email, the approval logs, the personnel records, and Dana's calendar. The investigator interviewed Grant after reviewing those documents. I wasn't present, but I received a summary of the topics covered. Grant maintained that he had expected employees to understand the risks and use their judgment. He said his comments about post-launch reconciliation referred to a possible contingency, not an instruction to bypass validation. That explanation didn't match the February 18th email. It also didn't match the earlier project notes. When asked why he had described my decision as unauthorized, Grant reportedly said he believed I had taken ownership of the timing once I coordinated the launch steps. That sentence stayed with me because coordinating a decision and authorizing a decision were two different things at Harbor Point. The policy said so, the approval matrix said so. Grant had signed off on that structure himself. The investigator also reviewed Grant's performance evaluations. They praised his ability to maintain launch dates, calm clients, and push teams through obstacles. The language was polished and positive. There was almost nothing about the missing decision logs, nothing substantial about exceptions being documented, nothing about what happened when employees raised concerns and the launch still moved forward. Speed had been measured. The cost of speed had not. By late March, Luis scheduled a clarification meeting for employees connected to the Civic Flow project and the earlier reviews. It wasn't called a hearing. It wasn't open to the public. No one was asked to confront Grant, and Grant was not in the room. I attended from a small conference room with Tessa and several others. Dana joined remotely for the portion concerning her personnel record. Luis stood at the front with his legal pad. He looked tired but composed. "I'm going to separate confirmed facts from unresolved questions," he said. "That distinction matters." Then he explained that the internal account of the Civic Flow failure was being corrected. The company record would no longer state that I had independently authorized the validation bypass. The archived email showed that Grant had instructed the launch group to move the validation hold to post-launch reconciliation. The approval process had not been followed, but the responsibility for that failure could not accurately be assigned to me alone. I felt my shoulders drop, not all at once. Just enough for me to notice how tightly I'd been holding myself. Luis continued. The company also found that several project records omitted management directions concerning schedule exceptions. We are reviewing whether those omissions were accidental, negligent, or deliberate. No conclusion about individual discipline will be announced today. That sentence mattered too. He wasn't turning the meeting into a public pile-on. He didn't use loaded language. He didn't invite people to share rumors or label Grant anything beyond what the records supported. He said the affected personnel files would be reviewed for accuracy. He said employees would not be disciplined for raising documented process concerns. And he said any future launch exception would require a named approver, a written reason, and a record of the associated risk. Tessa asked whether quality assurance could stop a launch when a validation hold remained unresolved. Luis answered immediately, yes, if the concern is documented, the launch pauses until the designated executive reviews it. That was the first time I heard someone at Harbor Point say the boundary out loud. Not, try to work it out. Not, don't be the reason we miss the date. Pause, document, review. After the meeting, Tessa and I stood near the coffee station while people filtered out. No one celebrated. A few coworkers apologized for believing the first version. One person admitted they hadn't known what to believe and had stayed quiet. I didn't blame them for every silence. I knew what fear could do in an office. It could make people mistake distance for neutrality. Tessa closed her planner and looked at me. "I'm glad the record is changing," she said, "but I don't want the company to stop there. Neither do I, because correcting my file was necessary. It wasn't enough. Dana needed her own record corrected. Tessa deserved credit for raising quality concerns instead of being remembered as difficult. And Harbor Point needed a process that didn't depend on whether someone powerful chose to tell the complete story afterward." That evening, Luis sent a written follow-up to everyone who attended. It included the corrected civic flow summary and a statement that the outside investigator's final report was still pending. The report would address Grant's authorization decisions, the prior projects, the personnel records, and whether employees had faced retaliation after questioning launch instructions. At the bottom, Luis wrote that the company would provide next steps after the report was complete. I read that message twice. The first twist had rescued me from a claim that the records disproved. The second twist showed me that my experience had not been an isolated misunderstanding. And now the question was bigger than whether Harbor Point would admit I had been wrongfully blamed. It was whether the company would be willing to document what the pattern had cost and act on it. The investigators' final interview notes were due by the end of the week. For the first time since February, I wasn't waiting to find out whether my memory was good enough. I was waiting to see what the evidence required Harbor Point to do next. The final report arrived on March 30th in a secure message from Luis. He asked me to read it before our meeting and reminded me that I could have Priya review any part of the proposed resolution. I printed the report anyway. I needed to see it on paper with the pages spread across my kitchen table and the facts in front of me. The first conclusion was clear. I had coordinated the Civic Flow 4.2 migration, but I hadn't possessed final authority to approve the production cutover. The second was even more direct. Grant had instructed me to move the validation hold to post-launch reconciliation. The investigators had matched his February 18th email to the approval logs, Tessa's planner, and the earlier project records. The report stated that Grant had misrepresented the chain of authorization during the emergency meeting and in the termination process. I read that sentence twice, then I kept going. The investigators had found similar conduct on at least 3 prior projects. In each case, Grant pushed for a schedule exception, failed to make the approval path clear, and later described the employee closest to the work as having acted independently. The pattern was no longer something I had to explain from memory. It was in the report. But the investigators didn't write me as flawless either. They noted that I hadn't preserved the project chat when the concern first came up. I hadn't asked Grant to restate his instruction in a separate approval form. I had relied on his position and assumed that if the decision went badly, the record would speak for itself. It hadn't. The report called those failures training issues and documentation gaps. It did not call them the cause of the launch failure. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected. I had made mistakes. I had been too trusting. I had tried to be cooperative when I should have been precise. But being imperfect wasn't the same as authorizing a decision I didn't have the authority to make. Luis met with me and Priya the next morning in one of Harbor Point's glass conference rooms. He had his legal pad in front of him, but this time he also had a formal resolution packet. He said, The company is rescinding your termination. I felt my shoulders drop before I could stop them. He continued. Harbor Point would restore my benefits and seniority, pay the back wages I had lost, and reimburse my documented legal expenses. The inaccurate statement in my personnel record would be removed and replaced with a correction reflecting the investigation's findings. Then he offered me a new position. Implementation Controls Lead, reporting to a different executive. I looked down at the packet. Would I have authority to stop a launch? Luis paused. That pause told me the job title wasn't enough. I need that in writing, I said. Not as a promise, as part of the role. Priya gave a small nod beside me. I explained what I needed. Every release decision had to be entered into a decision log. Any schedule exception needed a named approver, a written reason, and a recorded risk. If an employee raised a documented validation concern, that employee could pause the launch while the concern was reviewed. And if someone faced retaliation for raising it, the matter would go to an independent review process. Luis wrote each point down. Then he said, those safeguards will apply beyond your role. They'll be part of the company's launch process. That was the moment the resolution became larger than my job. I didn't want a special arrangement that protected only me. I wanted the next person to have a process that didn't depend on whether they happened to save the right email. A week later, Harbor Point held a formal meeting with Grant. I wasn't in the room and I didn't need to be. The report had already established what happened. This wasn't a performance of my pain. It was an accountability process. Grant received a formal disciplinary finding and lost eligibility for promotion. Harbor Point offered him a supervised transition, and he resigned on April 8th. I heard that through Luis, not through office gossip. That detail mattered too. No one circulated a humiliating announcement. No one encouraged people to celebrate his departure. The company documented the decision and moved forward. Dana's record was corrected as part of the same review. The old negative account of her project was removed, and Harbor Point provided her with a neutral reference. When Dana told me, she sounded relieved, but careful. She said, I didn't need anyone to call me a hero. I just needed the file to stop saying something that wasn't true. I understood that completely. There's a strange pressure that comes with being vindicated. People assume the ending should feel joyful, like the truth walks into the room and everything painful disappears. That wasn't my experience. I felt relief. I felt tired. I felt angry about the weeks I had spent wondering whether I had somehow misunderstood my own work. I also felt embarrassed that I had trusted Grant's authority so completely, and yes, I felt some satisfaction when the record was corrected. But I didn't want Grant's life destroyed. I wanted my name cleared, my income restored, and a system that made the next scapegoating attempt harder to carry out. Those are different things. I signed the resolution only after the reporting protections and decision log requirements were added in writing. Priya read every page. I read several sections twice. Once I set the pen down because my hand was shaking. Luis didn't rush me. He simply said, "Take the time you need." That was a small sentence, but it represented everything that had been missing before. Time to verify, space to ask, permission to make an important decision visible instead of pushing it through on confidence alone. On April 20th, I was scheduled to return to Harbor Point. The night before, I laid out my badge, my notebook, and a clean folder for the new controls process. I used 3 colors of tabs instead of 5. I was trying not to turn documentation into another way to punish myself. Before bed, I opened a blank page and wrote one sentence at the top. An important decision should never exist only in someone else's memory. The next morning, I would walk back into the warehouse office as an employee whose record had been restored, but not as the same person who had left it. The question waiting for me wasn't whether I could return. It was whether I could build something safer without pretending the old trust had never been broken. On April 20th, I walked back into Harbor Point with a new title, a restored employee badge, and a level of caution I hadn't needed before. Implementation controls lead. The words looked official on the paperwork. In the office, they felt more complicated. My desk was still in the renovated warehouse space in Franklin. The glass conference rooms were still there. The records room still smelled faintly like cardboard and printer toner. But I didn't feel like I was returning to the same workplace. I was returning to a place I understood differently. A few coworkers stopped me during that first week. One apologized for believing Grant's explanation. Another said they hadn't known what to say after I was dismissed. A few people stayed polite but distant. I didn't demand apologies from anyone. Trust doesn't come back because a report says the truth out loud. It comes back through repeated behavior. Someone follows the process when it's inconvenient. Someone writes down the decision instead of relying on memory. Someone pauses before agreeing to a risky shortcut. That mattered more to me than a dramatic welcome. Tessa was part of the team designing Harbor Point's new release checklist, and she received formal credit for her quality control work. I watched her explain the validation steps in a planning meeting, calmly and precisely, without shrinking her concerns to make them easier for other people to hear. That was its own kind of repair. The company also changed the approval process. Schedule exceptions had to be approved in writing. Decision logs were preserved with the project records. Project ownership was separated from final release authority, so the person coordinating the work couldn't be quietly treated as the person who approved the cutover. And if someone raised a documented validation concern, they had the authority to pause the launch. I didn't consider that a special favor. It should have been ordinary. My family noticed the difference in me before I fully did. I still worried about money. I still replayed parts of the emergency meeting, but I no longer described myself as lucky to be included whenever someone handed me responsibility without giving me authority. For a long time, my first instinct had been to prove Grant wrong. I wanted every person who had doubted me to understand exactly what happened. But the more I worked on the new controls, the clearer it became that proving one person wrong wasn't enough. The lasting lesson was making important decisions visible before a crisis gave someone else room to rewrite them. Documentation isn't paranoia. Boundaries aren't disloyalty. Asking who has final approval isn't slowing the team down. It's protecting the team from confusion later. I also learned that accountability doesn't have to look like humiliation. Grant faced a formal finding, lost promotion eligibility, and left through a supervised transition. Dana's record was corrected. My own record was restored. The system changed in ways that could help people who might never know my name. That was enough. Being blamed can make you question your memory, your judgment, and even your right to speak carefully. But evidence, honest allies, clear communication, and lawful choices can restore your agency without turning pain into cruelty. The email gave me proof, but the boundary gave me a future. I can do good work without agreeing to disappear inside someone else's explanation. My takeaway is that honest communication, accountability, and clear boundaries matter more than winning a family conflict. What do you think?